The walk-in cooler at Baymont Grocery had been dying quietly for 6 years, and I was the only one who knew how to bring it back. I'd worked the meat department for 11 years, long enough to know that when the compressor started that low hum followed by silence, you had maybe 40 minutes before $4,000 of inventory turned into a health code violation. I kept a multimeter in my locker. Nobody asked me to. I just did it. That Tuesday, the hum started during the lunch rush. I set down my knife and walked toward the back. Rich, our new operations manager, stepped in front of me, in front of everyone. "This isn't your job anymore, Danny," he said, loud enough for the whole department to hear. "Stay in your lane." I looked at him, then at the cooler door. "Understood," I said. I went back to my station and picked up my knife. From that moment on, every cooler problem was going exactly where company policy said it should. Baymont Grocery sat on the edge of a strip mall in a town where everybody still remembered the name of their butcher. I was that butcher. 11 years behind the counter, and before that, 3 more as a stock kid learning where every wire in that building actually ran. Nobody trained me on refrigeration. I trained myself out of necessity. Corporate maintenance was based 2 hours away, and their average response time was sometime tomorrow, maybe. When you're staring at 600 pounds of ribeye creeping past 41 degrees, maybe tomorrow isn't an answer. So I learned. I bought a multimeter with my own money. I watched YouTube videos on compressor cycles during my lunch breaks. I called an HVAC buddy from high school and asked him dumb questions until they stopped being dumb. Over the years, I lost count of how many times a 2-minute fix from me saved the store from tossing an entire delivery. Conservatively, it was tens of thousands of dollars. Nobody put it in a report. Nobody gave me a raise for it. It just became understood. If the cooler acted up, you found Danny. 3 store managers came and went during those years, and every single one of them knew exactly what I was doing back there. Not one of them ever told me to stop. Why would they? I was solving their biggest liability for free, off the clock, without being asked. The company benefited. Quietly. Nobody signed anything. Nobody acknowledged it out loud. It just worked, the way things work when everybody's too busy to question why. Then Rich transferred in from the Ohio district office, fresh off a promotion, and within his first week he was walking the floor with a clipboard, watching who did what, and noticing, with visible irritation, that half his employees were solving problems without asking his permission first. Rich Kessler had been a store manager for exactly 4 months when he landed the operations manager title at Baymont, and it was clear from day one that he intended to make the most of it. He was the kind of man who measured his authority by how many people asked his permission, not by results, not by whether the store ran smoothly, by whether people asked first. His first week, he rearranged the break room schedule that had worked fine for a decade, just to prove he could. His second week, he started carrying a small notebook, the kind you'd use for grocery lists, except he used his to write down names. "We have procedures," he told the produce manager after she'd swapped a delivery time without emailing him first, even though the swap saved the store from a spoiled shipment. "I don't pay you to think," he told a 16-year veteran of the bakery department, when she suggested a faster way to rotate the day-old bread. "Stay in your lane" became something he said so often that the overnight stock crew started saying it to each other as a joke, right up until the joke stopped being funny. He started documenting things, small things, an employee clocking in 4 minutes late, a cart left in the wrong corral, a radio left on the wrong channel. None of it mattered on its own, but stacked together it built a file. A file on people who'd been doing their jobs well for years, filed by a man who'd been there 16 weeks. He never said it outright, but everyone understood. Initiative made him nervous. A store running well because employees solved problems on their own was to Rich a store where he wasn't necessary, and Rich needed to be necessary. I stayed out of his notebook for a while. I kept my head down, did my job, and quietly kept the cooler alive the way I always had, figuring a man like that would either settle in or move on. Then, on a Tuesday during the lunch rush, the cooler alarm went off, and every single person in that department, without thinking twice, turned and looked at me. The alarm had a particular pitch to it, high, insistent, the kind of sound that cut through the noise of a Tuesday lunch rush like a blade. I didn't even think about it. My knife went down on the cutting board. My apron came off my shoulder where it had bunched, and I was already moving toward the back hallway before the second beep hit. I made it maybe 10 feet. "Danny," Rich's voice carried across the whole meat department, loud enough that the two customers at the deli case turned to look. Loud enough that Carla, who ran the register up front, poked her head around the corner to see what was happening. I stopped and turned around. "This isn't even your job anymore," Rich said, walking toward me with that clipboard tucked under his arm like a shield. "You're not certified for that equipment. Maintenance handles refrigeration issues, not you." "Maintenance is 2 hours out," I said, keeping my voice even. "By the time they get here, we could lose the whole delivery. I've fixed this exact issue a dozen times. It's usually the condenser fan." "That's not the point." His jaw tightened. "The point is procedure. You call it in, you wait. That's how it works here now." I glanced past him at the cooler door, at the little red light blinking above the handle. Every minute we stood there arguing was a minute the temperature climbed. "Rich, with respect, by the time a ticket gets filed and someone drives out here, we're talking 3-4 hours minimum. That cooler's got 600 pounds of product in it right now." "Then it's a good thing that's not going to be your problem anymore, isn't it?" He said it flat. Final. The kind of sentence that isn't really a sentence, it's a wall. I looked around. Carla was still watching from the front. Two of the stock guys had drifted toward the back hallway, pretending to restock paper towels, but clearly listening. Nobody said anything. Nobody had to. Everybody understood exactly what was happening. The guy who'd quietly saved this store thousands of dollars a dozen times over was being told in front of the whole department to stand down. "So just to be clear," I said slowly, "if that cooler fails, you want me to do nothing. Just call it in and wait." "That's exactly what I want." "And if it takes hours?" "Then it takes hours. That's not a you problem, Danny. That's a maintenance problem." I nodded once. I didn't argue further. There was no point arguing with a man who'd already decided the conversation was over before it started. "Understood," I said again, the same word I'd used the first time because there wasn't much else worth saying. I walked back to my station, picked my knife back up. Carla caught my eye for half a second and gave me a look that said, "Is he serious?" And I just shrugged because there was nothing else to do about it standing there in front of everyone. But driving home that night, something occurred to me. Rich hadn't just told me to back off. He'd made it official, publicly, in front of witnesses. And a man that eager to draw a line in the sand usually isn't thinking about what happens when someone asks him to put it in writing. So the next morning, before my shift even started, I opened my email and began typing. I've always believed that if someone's going to give you an order, especially one that contradicts 11 years of practice, you make them own it in writing. Verbal instructions evaporate. Emails don't. So that Wednesday morning, before I'd even clocked in, I sat in my truck in the parking lot and typed out a message to Rich. I kept it simple, kept it polite, kept it exactly professional enough that nobody reading it later could accuse me of being difficult. "Hi, Rich. Just want to make sure I understand the new procedure correctly following yesterday's conversation. Going forward, I should not attempt any troubleshooting or repairs on the walk-in cooler or any refrigeration equipment, and should instead report any issues through the standard maintenance ticket system and wait for a technician. Can you confirm this is correct so I follow it exactly? Thanks, Danny." I hit send before my shift started, and honestly, I half expected him to call me into his office and walk it back. Men like Rich usually do, once they see their own instructions typed out plainly in front of them. It's one thing to say something in the heat of a busy floor. It's another to put your name on it. Rich didn't walk it back. By that afternoon, his reply landed in my inbox. "Correct. You are not authorized to perform repairs or troubleshooting on any refrigeration equipment. All issues must be reported through the maintenance ticket system and escalated to management. This is not optional. It R. Kessler." I read it twice. Then I printed it. Then I printed it again, just to have a second copy at home in case the store printer decided to have opinions about it later. That night, I did something I probably should have done years earlier. I pulled up the employee handbook, the real one, the 90-some page PDF that HR sends out during onboarding and that nobody ever opens again after their first week. I read through the whole thing at my kitchen table with a highlighter, and what I found changed how I looked at the entire situation. Section 4.2, under Equipment and Safety. Any employee performing repairs or maintenance on refrigeration or food safety equipment without proper certification is in violation of company policy, and any resulting incident is the responsibility of store management, not the employee. Section 6.1, under food safety escalation, any refrigeration failure affecting stored inventory must be reported immediately through the maintenance ticket system, with escalation to regional operations if unresolved within 2 hours. Section 6.4, refrigeration service providers are required to respond to critical tickets, meaning food safety related, temperature critical calls, within a guaranteed window, separate from routine maintenance requests. I sat back in my chair and just stared at that last one for a while. Rich hadn't just told me to stop doing something I wasn't technically supposed to be doing in the first place. He'd walked straight into it, in writing, with his own name attached, in a way that put the entire responsibility for what came next squarely on him and on the company's official maintenance process. A process that, as far as I could tell, had never once been tested under real pressure. Because I'd always been the pressure release valve. I was the reason it had never needed to be tested. I made copies of everything. The text messages I still had from years back, co-workers thanking me for catching a compressor issue before a weekend, the email, the handbook pages, highlighted and dated. I put it all in a folder, a real one, the kind with a metal clasp, and I kept it in my truck. I wasn't planning anything. I want to be clear about that. I wasn't scheming, wasn't hoping for disaster. I was just a man who'd been told, in writing, to stop doing a job that had never officially been his. And for the first time in 11 years, I let myself consider what would actually happen the next time that cooler failed for real. Because if it did, and it went where every failure eventually goes, Rich had just made absolutely sure it would land on nobody but himself. The next cooler hiccup came 8 days later on a Thursday afternoon, and it was nothing. A minor temperature drift, the kind I could have corrected in 90 seconds with a screwdriver and a reset switch. 6 months ago, I wouldn't have even mentioned it to anyone. I'd have handled it on my way to grab more trays and moved on with my day. Instead, I walked to the front office and filed a maintenance ticket, exactly like the handbook said. I noted the time. I noted the temperature reading. I noted that I was reporting it per management instruction, and I CC'd Rich on the email, same as I planned to do every single time going forward. Then I went back to my station and waited. Rich saw the email. He didn't say anything about it, just gave me a small nod across the floor, like a man confirming his authority had been properly respected. As far as he was concerned, this was exactly how things were supposed to work now. The maintenance company's response time for a non-critical ticket was, per their own contract, 48 hours. 48 hours for a temperature drift that I could have fixed before my coffee got cold. So for 2 full days, we kept a section of the walk-in roped off, moved the more sensitive product into the smaller reach-in coolers up front, and worked around it. It wasn't a disaster. It was just inconvenient, in the exact way that things become inconvenient when you replace a person who understood the equipment with a form that gets read by someone 2 hours away. It happened again the following week. A different issue this time. A door seal that wasn't latching fully, letting warm air creep in overnight. Another ticket, another wait. Another round of shuffling product between coolers, keeping half an eye on thermometers, hoping nothing tipped over the line before someone official showed up to look at it. Staff started noticing the pattern. Carla asked me once quietly why I didn't just fix it myself like I used to. Not my job anymore, I told her, and left it at that. She gave me a look like she understood exactly what was happening, even if she didn't say so out loud. The stock crew started grumbling about having to relocate pallets every time a ticket got filed instead of a 2-minute fix handling it on the spot. One of the assistant managers mentioned, in a meeting I wasn't in but heard about afterward, that the new procedure seemed to be creating more work than it solved. Rich brushed it off. Procedure was procedure, he said. Consistency mattered more than convenience. He wasn't wrong that consistency mattered. He was wrong about what consistency was costing him. I kept every ticket number, kept every timestamp, kept a running log at home of exactly how long each maintenance response actually took versus what would have taken me minutes on my own. 6 issues over 5 weeks, each one small on its own, each one a little seed of frustration building in a department that used to run without a hitch. Rich never once considered changing course. Admitting the policy was creating delays would have meant admitting he'd been wrong on that Tuesday in front of the whole department. And a man like Rich didn't do that. Not for a broken seal, not for a temperature drift, not for anything. So the small failures kept coming, one after another, each one handled exactly by the book, each one a little more evidence stacking quietly in a folder in my truck. And none of us knew it yet, but all of that was just the warm-up. Because 3 weeks later, on a Friday night with a walk-in packed tighter than it had been all year, the compressor didn't just drift. It died completely. Friday nights at Baymont were always the heaviest. A big weekend delivery had come in that morning. Over $8,000 in fresh meat, dairy, and prepped product. All of it packed into a walk-in that was already running close to capacity. By 6 p.m., the store was slammed, registers 3 deep, and nobody had a spare second to think about anything beyond getting through the rush. That's when the alarm went off. Not the soft chirp of a minor drift, the full alarm, the one that meant the compressor had failed outright. I was at my station, elbow deep in a rush order when I heard it. My whole body reacted before my brain caught up, a decade of instinct pulling me toward that door. I actually took 2 steps before I stopped myself. Carla saw me freeze. "Danny, I know," I said. I walked to the cooler door and checked the readout instead of touching a single dial. 44 degrees and climbing fast. In a full walk-in that size, with that much product, we had maybe 2 hours before we crossed into territory the health department would care about. Within minutes, half the crew had gathered near the back hallway. Someone yelled for me to go look at it. Someone else said they'd seen me fix worse in 5 minutes. A stock kid literally handed me a screwdriver like it was an offering. I didn't take it. Instead, I pulled the folded printout of Rich's email out of my back pocket, the one I'd been carrying with me for weeks, half expecting a moment exactly like this one, and I held it up so the people nearest me could see it. "I'm not authorized to touch it," I said. "Company policy. I have to report it and wait." A couple of the guys thought I was joking at first. I wasn't. I filed the maintenance ticket right there on my phone, marked it critical, noted the time down to the minute, and walked back to my register like nothing was on fire, because as far as my job description was concerned, nothing was. Rich showed up 11 minutes later, already red in the face from someone calling him at home. He took one look at the readout and one look at me standing calmly by my station. "Why haven't you fixed it?" he said. I just looked at him. "You told me not to," I said. "In writing. Should I go get it?" His jaw worked for a second like he wanted to argue his way out of his own email. He didn't. He just turned and called the maintenance line himself, and I watched his face fall as he heard back what I already knew from experience. Nobody could get someone out to us until at least 10, maybe 11 that night. Emergency techs were tied up 2 counties over on a hospital job that took priority over a grocery store. So we waited. The temperature kept climbing. 46 degrees. 49, 52. Employees started begging me directly, one after another, like I was some kind of gatekeeper holding back the flood on principle rather than instruction. I understood why they were frustrated. I didn't blame a single one of them, but I'd learned a long time ago that the moment you break your own rule to save someone else's mistake, you become the one holding the mistake. "I can't," I told each of them, and I meant it 2 different ways at once. I wasn't allowed to. And honestly, at this point, I didn't want to be the one who let Rich off the hook a second time. By 9 p.m., we'd lost the entire walk-in. Every pound of that Friday delivery, all $8,000 of it, sitting somewhere between 55 and 60 degrees with no fix in sight. Rich paced the back hallway, making call after call, his voice rising with everyone, as the reality of what was happening settled over him. The maintenance tech finally arrived at 10:30. By then, it didn't matter how fast he worked. The damage had already been done, logged, time-stamped, and locked in. But standing there in that ruined cooler at 11 p.m., watching Rich try to explain the situation to someone on the phone, I understood something that hadn't fully hit me until that exact moment. The spoiled food wasn't actually the expensive part of what had just happened. The expensive part hadn't even started yet. What most people don't understand about a refrigeration failure in a commercial food environment is that the spoiled product is only the beginning of the paperwork. It's the smallest piece of a much larger machine that starts turning the moment a temperature log crosses a threshold it isn't supposed to cross. Every walk-in cooler in a store like Baymont is required by state food code to maintain a continuous temperature log, either digital or manual, recording readings at set intervals throughout the day. That log isn't just a formality, it's a legal document. Health inspectors can request it at any time, and during an incident like ours, it becomes the single most important piece of evidence in determining what happens next. To the inventory, to the store, and eventually to the people responsible for what went wrong. Once a walk-in crosses 41 degrees for an extended period, the food safety clock starts running in a very specific, very unforgiving way. Depending on the category of product in raw meat, dairy, prepared foods, there are strict windows for how long something can sit in the temperature danger zone before it's legally required to be discarded. No exceptions. No judgment calls. No, it still smells fine. Our walk-in had sat above 50 degrees for close to 4 hours. Every category in that cooler was past the line. That meant disposal. All of it. Not selectively, not the obviously spoiled items. Every single unit, logged, photographed, and documented for eventual loss reporting and insurance purposes, then physically removed and destroyed according to health code disposal procedures. I'd seen small versions of this before, a shelf here, a pallet there. I had never seen it applied to an entire walk-in. By Saturday morning, the store's regional food safety coordinator, a woman named Patricia Voss, was on site personally. That alone told me how seriously this was being taken. Coordinators like her didn't usually show up in person for a single location incident unless corporate wanted eyes on it directly. She started by pulling the temperature logs. Then she asked for the maintenance ticket history for the location going back 6 months. Then she asked, very specifically, whether anyone on staff had reported any prior refrigeration issues in the weeks leading up to the failure. That's when I handed her my folder. 6 tickets over 5 weeks, each one time-stamped, each one showing a response time that stretched into hours or days for issues that, historically, had never been allowed to sit that long. I explained, calmly and factually, that I had previously handled minor refrigeration troubleshooting as an informal part of my role, that I had been explicitly instructed in writing to stop, and that every ticket in that folder represented me following that instruction to the letter. Patricia read through the folder twice. She didn't say much while she read it, but I noticed she flagged the email from Rich, the one confirming I wasn't authorized to touch the equipment, and set it to the side, separate from the rest. "You reported every one of these," she said, more statement than question. "Everyone," I said. "Exact time filed, exact time responded to. It's all there." She asked for copies of everything. I'd already made 3 sets, so I handed one over without hesitation. Over the next few days, compliance requests started coming in from higher up than Patricia. Questions about the store's maintenance contract, questions about response time guarantees that were supposedly built into that contract but clearly weren't being honored, questions about why a location with a documented pattern of delayed responses hadn't escalated the issue before it became a total loss. I answered every question I was asked, honestly and without embellishment. I didn't need to exaggerate anything. The timeline spoke for itself. 6 warning signs, 6 tickets, 6 delayed responses, and then 1 catastrophic failure that could have been caught in its early stages by someone who used to catch exactly these kinds of things, until he was specifically told, in writing, not to. What struck me most, watching this unfold, was how quickly the tone in the store shifted once compliance got involved. Rich, who had spent weeks insisting that procedure was procedure and that consistency mattered more than convenience, suddenly found himself needing to explain, in very specific terms, why he had personally instructed an experienced employee to stop performing preventative work that had, by every available record, saved the company significant money for years. He tried at one point to frame it as a liability issue, that an uncertified employee touching refrigeration equipment exposed the company to risk. It wasn't an unreasonable argument on its face, except Patricia had already found the maintenance contract, and the contract had its own clause. Any facility could designate an employee for basic preventative troubleshooting, provided they'd received informal training without violating liability terms, a clause that had apparently been sitting in that contract the entire time, unused, because nobody in management had ever bothered to read it. By the end of that week, Patricia's report went up the chain, attached with every document I'd provided. Corporate started asking a question that Rich clearly hadn't anticipated having to answer. Why had an experienced employee, with a documented track record of preventing exactly this kind of failure, been explicitly forbidden from doing so in writing by a manager with 16 weeks on the job? Nobody had an answer for that yet, but people were starting to look for one. By the following Monday, what had started as a single ruined walk-in cooler had turned into something with its own momentum, moving through the company in a direction none of us, least of all Rich, could control anymore. HR sent someone out from the regional office, a soft-spoken man named Trevor Marsh, who introduced himself as handling operational conduct reviews, which I quickly learned was corporate language for an investigation with a friendlier name. He set up in the small conference room behind the deli counter, the one usually reserved for staff meetings and the occasional vendor pitch. And over the course of 3 days, he called in nearly every employee on the schedule for a conversation. I went in expecting to have to defend myself. I walked out realizing I hadn't needed to defend anything at all. Trevor asked me to walk him through my history with the refrigeration equipment start to finish. I told him plainly, no exaggeration, no editorializing. 11 years on the floor, no formal training, just self-taught troubleshooting born out of necessity because maintenance response times had never been fast enough to matter in a real emergency. I told him about the compressor issues I'd caught early over the years, the seals I'd replaced, the countless small interventions that never made it into any official report because nobody had ever asked me to file one. And then I told him about the email. I handed him a copy, the same one I'd been carrying in my truck for weeks, and watched him read it twice before setting it down. "So you stopped," he said. "Completely." "Completely," I said, "exactly as instructed." He nodded slowly, the way people do when a story is confirming something they already suspected but hadn't yet had proof of. What I didn't expect was how consistent everyone else's account turned out to be. Carla went in after me and told Trevor almost the identical story, unprompted, how she'd asked me, weeks earlier, why I'd stopped fixing things myself, and how I'd told her it wasn't my job anymore. She hadn't seen the email at that point. She didn't need to. She'd simply watched the pattern play out in real time, the same way everyone on that floor had. The stock crew told him about the pallets they'd had to relocate over and over, every time a minor issue turned into a multi-day wait instead of a 2-minute fix. One of them, a younger guy named Curtis, who'd only been with the store a year, told Trevor flatly that he didn't understand why the guy who always fixed it had suddenly stopped being allowed to. He said it exactly like that, like it was the most obvious thing in the world, because to the people working the floor, it was. Then came the maintenance company's regional dispatcher, who Trevor interviewed by phone. She confirmed what I'd already documented, average response times of 2 to 5 days for non-critical tickets, and a contractual guarantee for critical food safety-related calls that, in practice, had never once been tested at our location before that Friday night, because nothing had ever been allowed to escalate that far under my watch. She was almost apologetic about it, explaining that Baymont's service tier simply wasn't built for same-day non-emergency response, and that nobody from the store had ever flagged that as a problem before. Because, again, it had never been a problem before. The most damning part, though, came from 2 former store managers Trevor tracked down and interviewed separately. Both of them independently described the exact same arrangement, that they'd known I handled minor refrigeration issues informally, that they'd never asked me to stop, and that they'd considered it, in the words of one of them, one of the reasons this store never had the problems other locations did. Neither of them had ever documented it officially. Neither of them had ever needed to. It had simply worked, quietly, for years, until someone came in who cared more about process than results. Trevor pulled the store's inventory loss reports going back 3 years and laid them next to the 6 weeks of tickets from my folder. The contrast was stark enough that he mentioned it to me directly, which I got the sense wasn't standard practice for someone in his position. "In 3 years," he said, "this location's refrigeration-related loss was close to nothing. In the 5 weeks since the new policy went into effect, you've got 6 incidents and 1 total loss event worth roughly $8,000. I didn't say anything to that. I didn't need to. The numbers were doing exactly what numbers do when nobody's around to argue with them. Then Trevor called Rich in. I wasn't in the room for that conversation, obviously, but word travels fast in a store that size, and what I heard afterward, first from Carla, then confirmed later through the way people were looking at Rich for the rest of that week, was that his story didn't hold together the way he probably thought it would. He apparently opened by framing the whole thing as a liability decision, exactly the same argument he'd tried on Patricia the week before, that having an uncertified employee touch refrigeration equipment exposed the company to unnecessary risk, and that formalizing the maintenance ticket process was simply good management. Reasonable enough on its face, except Trevor already had the maintenance contract in front of him. The same clause Patricia had flagged, the one permitting designated employees with informal training to perform basic preventative troubleshooting without violating liability terms. When Trevor pointed that out, Rich apparently shifted his explanation, said he hadn't been fully aware of that clause, that he'd been acting on general company best practices rather than the specific contract language. Then Trevor showed him the email. His own email, the one confirming in writing that I was not authorized to perform any troubleshooting whatsoever, A blanket instruction that went well beyond any liability concern about uncertified repairs and directly contradicted his new explanation that he'd simply wanted things routed through proper channels for safety reasons. Rich reportedly tried a third explanation after that he'd meant for serious issues to go through maintenance, not minor ones, and that I'd misunderstood the scope of his instruction, which might have held up, except I'd specifically asked him to clarify that exact point in my original email, and his reply had been unambiguous. All issues, no exceptions, not optional. 3 explanations in one conversation, 3 different stories, each one contradicted by a piece of paper he'd personally signed off on weeks earlier. Trevor didn't need to argue with him. The documentation did that on its own. By Wednesday, Trevor had everything he needed. Witness statements that lined up perfectly with each other, financial records that told their own story, a maintenance contract that undercut Rich's stated justification, and an email trail that boxed him in from every direction he tried to turn. Every account from every employee matched, every number matched. The only thing in the entire file that didn't match anything else was Rich's own shifting explanation for why he'd made the decision he made. I found out later, almost by accident, that this wasn't actually the first red flag investigators had found on Rich. Someone from HR mentioned in passing that his personnel file already had a note from his previous store. Something about a documented pattern of overriding established procedures without proper authorization, filed months before he'd ever transferred to Baymont. Nobody had connected it at the time. Now, sitting next to everything happening here, it read less like an isolated incident and more like exactly the kind of pattern regional leadership tends to take very seriously once it starts repeating itself. Trevor didn't say much to me before he left that Wednesday afternoon, just thanked me for the documentation and told me the file would be moving up to regional leadership for review. But the way he said it, measured, careful, the tone of a man who already knew which direction this was heading, told me more than his actual words did. This wasn't ending with a quiet conversation in a back office anymore, it was going higher. By the following week, the file that had started as an internal HR review had grown into something with a very different weight to it. What Trevor Marsh had compiled didn't stay at the regional level for long. It moved up first to the district director, then to a name I'd never heard before that Wednesday. A VP of operations named Gordon Whitfield, whose office apparently oversaw close to 200 store locations across 4 states. I found out about most of this secondhand, the way you find out about anything happening several pay grades above you, through Carla, through the assistant manager, through the general hum of a store where everyone was quietly paying attention to a situation none of us fully controlled anymore. But a few pieces of it I got directly, because at that point I'd become someone people wanted to talk to, not around. The first thing to widen the scope was risk management. Once the total loss from the Friday incident was formally logged, inventory, disposal costs, the temporary rental of an emergency backup unit while the compressor was being replaced, the number came in just over $11,000, higher than the original estimate once every line item was accounted for. Numbers like that don't stay contained to a single store file. They get flagged automatically, routed to whoever handles insurance claims for spoiled inventory. And once insurance gets involved, insurance asks questions nobody in a small store conference room is equipped to answer on their own. The insurance adjuster wanted to know why a documented pattern of 6 prior incidents hadn't triggered an earlier escalation. That question, more than anything else, was what pulled finance into the conversation. A woman from the finance division ran the numbers on what those 6 weeks had actually cost the store. Not just in the one catastrophic loss, but in the smaller, quieter inefficiencies that had piled up underneath it. The labor hours spent relocating product every time a ticket got filed instead of resolved on the spot. The repeated partial spoilage on secondary units pressed into service as overflow. The cumulative delay costs that never show up as a single dramatic number, but bleed a location dry in 100 small ways. Her estimate, once she finished, put the true cost of those 5 weeks closer to $15,000. On top of the $11,000 from the final failure. That's when someone above Gordon's level decided this had stopped being a store-level personnel issue. An executive meeting was scheduled, not at Baymont, but at the regional office, with Gordon Whitfield chairing it personally. I wasn't in that room, obviously, and I want to be honest that some of what I describe here came to me afterward, filtered through people who were, or people close enough to the process to know how it went. But the broad strokes were consistent enough across every version I heard that I trust them. They started with the operations review, walking through exactly what had happened, in order from the original confrontation in front of the department, through the 6 escalating tickets to the total failure itself. Gordon reportedly asked more than once why nobody above Rich had caught the pattern earlier. 6 tickets in 5 weeks at a single location, all related to the same piece of equipment, should have triggered some kind of automatic review long before it reached a total loss. That it hadn't wasn't really about Rich specifically. It was about a gap in how the company tracked recurring maintenance issues at all, a gap that had simply never mattered before because informal employee intervention had been quietly filling it for years at Baymont, and as it turned out, at other locations too. That last part surprised even me when I heard it. Apparently, once this went up the chain, a couple of other regional managers mentioned, almost in passing, that similar informal arrangements existed at their own stores. Employees who'd picked up unofficial expertise over the years, handling small equipment issues nobody had ever asked them to handle, simply because it worked and nobody had ever thought to formalize it, which meant Baymont wasn't actually an isolated case. It was the first time anyone had been forced to look directly at a practice that had probably been holding together dozens of locations quietly for years, without a single line of official documentation behind it. Risk management framed it plainly. From what I was told, the company had been operating with an entire layer of invisible institutional knowledge that nobody had bothered to formalize, ensure against being lost, or protect through proper training and authorization. And the first time that knowledge got explicitly shut off in one location, the cost of its absence became impossible to ignore. Finance backed that framing up with the numbers. Insurance backed it up with their own questions about why an obvious, documented risk pattern hadn't been addressed sooner. Somewhere in that meeting, the conversation stopped being about 6 weeks at one store and started being about something considerably larger. How many other locations were quietly running the same way? How much institutional knowledge existed off the books across the company, and what it would cost, structurally, to actually formalize and protect that knowledge instead of leaving it to chance, or to whichever manager happened to be in charge when someone decided it was time to enforce the rules exactly as written. But before any of that larger conversation could really move forward, there was still the matter of Rich. His decision, his written instruction, his shifting explanations under review, and a very specific, very costly outcome that traced back to him more directly than to anyone else in the building. Gordon apparently ended that first meeting the same way most executives end meetings they're not ready to close out completely, by scheduling another one, this time with Rich himself in the room. The second meeting happened on a Thursday, and this time Rich was in the room for all of it. I still wasn't there, obviously. A store meat cutter doesn't get invited into a regional VP's conference room, but between Trevor, who sat in as HR's representative, and a couple of things that made their way back through the district office grapevine, I got a fairly complete picture of how it went. And honestly, once I heard it, it played out almost exactly the way I'd expected it to, from that very first Tuesday when Rich stood in front of the whole department and told me to stay in my lane. Gordon Whitfield opened by laying the situation out plainly: the 6 prior incidents, the total failure, the 11,000 in direct losses, the estimated 15,000 in secondary costs, and the written instruction at the center of all of it. He asked Rich directly to explain his reasoning. Rich's first answer was the same one he'd given Trevor the week before: that it was a liability decision, that an uncertified employee handling refrigeration equipment exposed the company to unnecessary risk, and that centralizing everything through the maintenance ticket system was simply responsible management. Gordon, according to Trevor, didn't even argue with him right away. He just asked one question. If liability was the actual concern, why hadn't Rich looked into the maintenance contract's provision allowing designated employees with informal training to perform basic preventative work without violating those same liability terms, a provision that had existed the entire time, sitting in a contract Rich was responsible for managing? Rich apparently didn't have a clean answer for that. He pivoted again, this time saying he'd been focused on establishing consistent procedures across the board, that Danny's approach, my approach, had simply never been formalized or verified, and that as a new operations manager, he felt it was his responsibility to bring the location in line with standard practice. That might have landed better if it were his first explanation. It wasn't his second either. It was his third, in front of a VP who already had the email in front of him. The one where I'd asked him plainly to confirm the scope of his instruction, and he'd replied without any hedging at all. All issues, no exceptions, not optional, not a phased rollout of new procedure, not a plan to formalize my role. A flat, immediate shutdown, delivered publicly, in front of an entire department, with no transition plan, and no acknowledgement of what it would actually cost to lose that safety net overnight. Trevor told me later that Gordon read that email out loud in the meeting, word for word, and then just let the silence sit there for a moment before asking Rich to explain, again, how that specific instruction lined up with any of the three explanations he'd offered so far. It didn't. Everyone in that room knew it didn't. And I think that was the moment Rich understood he wasn't going to be able to talk his way out of this one. What made it worse for him, and I only found this out afterward, almost as an aside, was that the witness statements Trevor had gathered were being cross-referenced in real time. Carla's account, the stock crew's account, the two former store managers who'd both independently described the same long-standing, quietly beneficial arrangement. None of it wavered. None of it needed to be walked back or clarified. Every single person who'd been asked about what actually happened at Baymont told some version of the same story, because it was, simply, what had happened. Rich tried one more angle before the meeting wound down, that regardless of the paperwork, I should have used common sense during the Friday night failure, and stepped in anyway, policy or no policy, given the scale of what was at stake. Gordon's response to that, according to Trevor, was the one thing everyone in that room seemed to remember clearly afterward. He pointed out that Rich couldn't have it both ways. He couldn't discipline an employee for acting without authorization one month, and then blame that same employee for following his explicit written instruction the next. If Rich genuinely believed I should have exercised discretion and stepped in during an emergency, that discretion needed to have existed in the policy itself. It hadn't. He'd removed it completely, in writing, 8 days before the failure that supposedly proved I should have had it. There wasn't much left to say after that. Compliance had already confirmed I'd followed every instruction to the letter. Finance had already quantified the cost of the policy Rich had personally implemented. Risk management had already flagged the broader pattern across the company, unrelated to any single individual's mistake, but directly triggered by Rich's decision to shut down the one thing that had been quietly preventing it at our location. The meeting ended with Gordon saying he needed time to review everything formally before making a final call. But Trevor told me, in that understated way people talk when they already know how something's going to end, that he didn't expect it to take very long. He was right. The following week, we all found out exactly how it was going to end. Section 12, Justice and Long-Term Aftermath. The following Monday, Baymont got a visit that hadn't been scheduled through the usual channels. Gordon Whitfield himself, along with a district director I recognized from a single visit years earlier, and Trevor Marsh trailing a step behind them both. They didn't ask for the meat department. They went straight to the back office, where Rich had been keeping his distance from the rest of us for most of the previous week, ever since word had started spreading about how badly that second meeting had gone for him. Whatever was said in that office took less than 20 minutes. When the door opened again, Rich walked out carrying a small cardboard box, the kind that always seems to appear out of nowhere the moment someone's employment ends. And he didn't look at anyone on his way to the parking lot. Not Carla, who was ringing up a customer near the front. Not the stock crew, who'd stopped what they were doing without even trying to hide it. Not me, standing at my station where I'd been standing through almost this entire thing. He was gone before lunch. Gordon stayed behind afterward and asked to speak with the department, gathering whoever was on shift into a loose half circle near the deli counter. He didn't dress it up. He told us plainly that Rich's employment had been terminated, effective immediately, based on a pattern of decisions that had created unnecessary operational risk and financial loss for the company, separate from Beauvoir, but consistent with a documented history at his previous location. He thanked the staff for their patience through the process, and then, somewhat to my surprise, he specifically asked to speak with me alone once the group broke up. We talked in the same back office Rich had just been walked out of. Gordon was straightforward in a way I hadn't expected from someone at his level. No corporate softening, no vague language. He told me the company had reviewed everything, start to finish, and that as far as anyone could tell, I hadn't done a single thing wrong at any point in the entire 6 weeks. I'd followed instructions exactly as given, documented everything precisely as I should have, and never once tried to make the situation worse than it needed to be, even when I clearly could have. Then he told me something that actually caught me off guard. The company was formally reviewing its maintenance escalation policy company-wide, not just at Baymont, in direct response to what had happened here. Regional leadership had apparently spent the better part of the previous week discussing how many other locations were likely running on the same kind of quiet, informal, undocumented employee expertise that Baymont had relied on for years, arrangements that worked well right up until someone in a position of authority decided to shut them off without understanding what they'd actually be losing. Within a month, that review turned into something concrete. Corporate rolled out a new emergency authorization policy across every location in the district, a formal process for identifying employees with relevant informal experience, documenting their skills, and giving them limited, specific authorization to perform basic preventative troubleshooting on critical equipment during active emergencies, without needing to wait on a maintenance contract that had never been built for same-day response in the first place. It wasn't unlimited authority. It came with training requirements, documentation standards, and clear boundaries on what qualified as an emergency versus a routine repair. But it existed now in writing, exactly the kind of policy that would have made the entire mess at Baymont impossible in the first place. They also launched a cross-training program soon after, pairing experienced employees like me with newer staff, and eventually with the maintenance company's own technicians, so that basic troubleshooting knowledge wouldn't live and die with one person's tenure at one store. I ended up helping design part of that program myself. Once corporate reached out and asked whether I'd be willing to consult on it, I said yes. It felt strange, honestly, being asked for input on something I'd been quietly doing alone for over a decade, but it also felt like exactly the kind of acknowledgement that should have existed years earlier, long before any of this needed to happen to force the issue. The store itself changed in smaller, quieter ways too. A new operations manager transferred in about 3 weeks after Rich left. A woman named Diane Osei, who'd been running a location 2 towns over for the better part of 6 years. Her first week looked almost nothing like Rich's had. She spent most of it just watching how the store actually functioned, asking questions instead of issuing directives. And by the end of it, she'd pulled me aside specifically to ask about the cooler situation, since she'd heard some version of what happened before she even walked in the door. I told her the whole thing plainly, the same way I'd told Trevor and eventually Gordon. She listened, asked a few clarifying questions, and then told me something that stuck with me for a while afterward. That the mark of a good manager wasn't controlling every decision personally. It was knowing which decisions were safe to let experienced people make on their own. She formally authorized me through the new emergency policy to handle preventative refrigeration troubleshooting going forward, with proper documentation each time, and she made sure that authorization was on file, official, unambiguous, so that no future manager could ever again claim confusion about whether it was allowed. The company also recognized the 6 weeks I'd spent strictly following the old policy, in an odd, roundabout kind of way. Because the maintenance tickets I'd filed during that period had all been properly documented, they became part of the official record used to justify the new company-wide policy change. My name came up more than once in the internal materials Diane later showed me, not as someone who'd caused a problem, but as the clearest example of what happens when institutional knowledge gets shut off without a plan to replace it. There was a modest retroactive bonus attached to it too, along with a formal letter acknowledging years of unofficial contributions that had never been recognized before, which felt less about the money itself and more about finally having something in writing that matched what I'd actually been doing all along. In the months that followed, cooler failures at Baymont dropped back down to almost nothing. Not because the equipment magically improved, but because minor issues were being caught and handled early again, the way they always had been before someone decided that following procedure mattered more than preventing problems. The stock crew stopped grumbling about relocating pallets every other week. Carla stopped giving me that particular look she used to give me every time a ticket got filed for something we both knew I could have fixed in 90 seconds. The store just went back to running the way it always had, quietly, without anyone needing to make a scene about it. I think about that Tuesday sometimes, the one where Rich stood in front of the whole department and told me this wasn't my job anymore. At the time, it felt like being humiliated in front of people I worked with every day, over something that had never caused a single problem in 11 years. Looking back on it now, I don't think I ever needed to do anything dramatic to set things right. I never sabotaged a single ticket, never let anything fail on purpose, never once stepped outside the lines Rich drew for me, even when it would have been easy to. I just did exactly what I was told, exactly as it was written, and let the consequences of that instruction speak entirely for themselves. The most expensive mistake Rich ever made at that store wasn't the compressor that finally gave out on a Friday night. It was standing in front of an entire department and telling the one person who knew how to prevent that failure to stop doing his job, and then putting that instruction in writing, word for word, as if daring someone to prove him wrong. I didn't have to prove anything. He did that himself.